Check, check, check. 1, 2. Audio check. 1, 2. Check. 1, 2. That's good. You got it? Okay, worked.
I'll manage.
We're good to go.
Please start. Rob's gonna
Are we
start.
good? Rob starting?
Rob, you're good?
Yeah, we're good to go.
He's doing the welcome. Oh,
So I would like to welcome.
The mask off
You
when
want-
you're talking, please.
I'm not good enough without the mask.
No, because what happens is it gets muffled.
Okay.
I'm so sorry. And you
can
can
we
put
move
it back
apart?
on.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I would like to welcome people who are here joining us this evening, both in person and online. I really am excited to be engaging publicly with this work and with community. We need community input, we need community guidance. This is work that is in service of trans and gender diverse people in Toronto, and our voices matter in the course of this. I'm going to start us with a land acknowledgement, and the teachings that I have received are that we acknowledge the land and we acknowledge the people of the land. So the land that we are on right now here is the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I also acknowledge that Toronto is part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, and that both Treaty 13 and the Dish with One Spoon invite all of us to see ourselves as treaty people and to be in relation with people and with the land. In acknowledging treaty peoples, we acknowledge those who've come here as settlers, either as migrants in this generation or in generations past. We acknowledge those of us who've come here involuntarily, particularly those who were stolen and kidnapped and enslaved in the transatlantic slave trade. Today, we pay tribute also to ancestors of those of African origin and descent.
this time, I'd like to introduce Chief James Raymer, who's going to give some opening. Sorry? This time, I'd like to introduce Chief James Raymer, who's going to give some opening remarks.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us as we update you on the service's revised gender diverse trans inclusion policies, procedures, and member training and next steps. We look forward to hearing from you about our efforts to revise these procedures and training protocols to better serve trans and gender diverse members of the community, and for your input on how to assess the impact of this work. Receiving feedback from those who are impacted the most is essential to this process. Our panel tonight includes Christopher Williams from the Ontario Human Rights Commission, who will be speaking about data collection as it pertains to this work. I thank you for being here, Mr. Williams, and for your ongoing support. I would also like to acknowledge our Community Advisory Committee for their tireless efforts, along with our panel members, Dr. J. Wallace-Skelton, our expert consultant, Superintendent Lisa Crooker, Inspector John Babiar, and Staff Sergeant Maggie Mastro-Costas. Thank you to our Equity, Inclusion, and Human Rights members, Dr. May Fan, Laura Flyer, and Roseanne Bailey. I also want to recognize Deputy Chief of Police Myron Demkew, who is our executive lead on this project, and the many service members involved in this work. Thank you as well, Mr. Boyd Kodak, for continuing to provide us with your valuable experience, Mr. Kodak. We have faced several delays throughout this process due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and I thank the community for being patient with us. We are pleased to announce our mandatory member training will begin rolling out this spring, and our new and updated policies, procedures, and forms are currently publicly available on our website. This important work is ongoing, and we commit to doing better as we move forward. Throughout this journey, it is my hope that we can heal broken relationships, rebuild trust, and steps towards a new direction together. Thank you again for joining us tonight and for your ongoing involvement and commitment.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm just going to read over a few housekeeping rules, just so everybody, and welcome to those online as well. Just for the purposes, the washrooms are just down the hallway, non-binary washrooms. Also, please help yourself to the food that is in the back as we go through this evening. And any questions, please post them in the chat. And for those that are here, can just raise your hand. We do have a microphone located in the middle, or we can bring the microphone to you for accessibility. So please, this is where we're wanting to receive feedback. We have some presentations, and then we'll be opening the floor up for discussion. So again, if you have questions along the way, please pose those. At this time, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. J. Wallace-Skelton for introductions.
I'm actually going to start by sort of introducing the work of the project so far and giving people a bit of an orientation as to how have we got here. For some people, this is going to be familiar already, and for others, this is going to be new. It feels important to say that this work is remedy work. This is the work of repair, and it is work of making right past wrong. It also feels important to say that this work has been a decade in the making, and that the path here has taken some time. And my work in the project has really only been in the last 2-year span. All of the steps of the work that I'm going to go over have come out of the minutes of settlement from Waterman versus TPS. And so we're really seeing how that settlement is guiding what's happening and ways that policing can become trans and gender inclusive. The work has included consultations with community at multiple stages. So it's included in-person consultations at the 519. It included in-person focus groups with trans community members. This is in early 2020. It included 20 individual hour to an hour and a half interviews with trans and gender diverse community members through 2020 and 21, and the ongoing guidance of an advisory. So the work is required to be consultative, and really to say trans people's experience needs to lead what this looks like and needs to be involved at every step of the way. The work has included policy revisions, and we have another member of the panel who will review what those policy revisions are, but thinking about where trans people come into contact with police and ways that policy can acknowledge people's identities and can require respect. The work has extended beyond the settlement in terms of thinking about trans people who are employees of TPS and ways that they can be supported as well. Connected to policy has been procedure and forms, and the creation of 2 training modules. And I want to say the training modules are substantial. They are both an hour and a half in length. They both have mandatory test components to them. They are intended to orient people to the attitudes and behaviors and ways to show respect to trans people and understand challenges faced by trans community members. Other members of the panel are going to speak to this in detail, but that's sort of the overview of where have we got to in this work. I want to also say that this town hall is a pivotal moment in the work because we're shifting from the developing of policies and procedures and of training to saying, how do we assess this work? How do we know that this is making policing in Toronto safer for trans and gender diverse people? How do we know that police are able to demonstrate that trans and gender diverse people can trust them? How do we see that shift? And so this is the moment of saying, what might that look like? What are the measures? What are the assessments? How do we do that work of knowing that the intended impact is what's coming out of it? And if it isn't, what do we need to change to get there? For people looking forward, the timeline is that TPS members have 6 months to complete the training. It's a large force. People cannot be all trained at once. And then following that, there'll be a 6-month period of assessing the efficacy of the work, and then public reporting on what has come out of it. So welcome to this moment in shift. I'm going to turn it back to Lisa.
At this time, we're going to be introducing Chris Williams. The bio. Sorry about that.
It's okay. I can be back on the spot too.
Nope, I got it here. Thank you for that. So, Chris Williams from the Ontario Human Rights Commission is going to be giving a presentation. Chris currently works as a senior policy analyst with the Ontario Human Rights Commission, where he specializes in policing issues. Previously, he worked as a senior research advisor with the Anti-Racism Directorate, where, among other things, he functioned as a staff lead for the creation of the Ontario's first anti-Black racism strategy. His long-standing concerns with systemic injustice and human rights have been addressed in numerous publications, including the 2017 book, Boomerang Ethics, How Racism Affects All of Us, with Joseph Mensah, and his 2021 book, Crisis in Canada's Policing, with John Sewell. Please welcome Chris Williams.
Thank you all very much for coming out today. Appreciate it. And certainly for the TPS, thank you very much for the work you've done to this point in accordance with the settlement. Of course, from a community standpoint, it's always important to remain vigilant and to monitor the work very closely to ensure that it's carried out the way it's intended to in ways that are concordant with the interests of members of the trans community. So I want to speak about data collection from a human rights standpoint specifically. And I also want to speak about data collection in sort of analogous ways. I want to speak about existing data that's being collected in jurisdictions throughout Ontario in terms of use of force and traffic stops. And I want to speak about that because that's the data that actually exists, and it speaks to the promises and even some of the potential pitfalls of data collection as currently executed in this province and in multiple jurisdictions. So I want to just begin. Is anything being projected?
I'm working on
Okay. Should I talk about the actual topic at hand or the Raptors, or I don't know? Okay. Okay. So, in terms of forms of data, a lot of times, if we're going to play a game of word association, I say data. The automatic default assumption would be that we're speaking about numbers, hard numbers, quantitative data, and certainly we're all very familiar with how quantitative data plays itself out with respect to, for example, survey research, Stats Canada research, questionnaires, etc. And certainly quantitative data is going to be a cornerstone of the work that's done pursuant to this settlement. But I of course, hasten to add that quantitative data doesn't exhaust the range of possibilities in terms of data that falls under the, in terms of forms of data that are possible under this settlement. And so, in addition to quantitative data, we also have qualitative data, and that can come in the form of words. It can come in the form of photographs, videos, sound recordings. Those of you, for example, who've participated in focus groups are lending this or that institution a form of data. Now, it's often the case that quantitative data is greatly privileged, and qualitative data is regarded as less rigorous, far more subjective. But in our work, we have a document called Count Me In, which gets into the ins and outs of our perspective on data collection. It's quite obvious that even quantitative data is underpinned by and informed by qualitative perspectives, right? So in the domain of policing, of course, we have use of force data, which is informed in part based on police assessments of what's occurred. Has the individual civilian or civilians plural resisted in some way? Does it appear that a particular individual is inebriated, and etc.? And so those assessments are coming from a particular perspective, which may or may not be accurate, because we've seen instances in various jurisdictions where there's a particular police narrative about use of force that's subsequently undone by other evidence, like video evidence, right? So it's true that qualitative data and quantitative data can be spoken of in ways that render them distinct, but there's also a certain degree of interpenetration, that the qualitative data is often underpinned by qualitative insights. So that's the first thing in terms of forms of data. Is this up now?
Of course it is.
Okay, thank you, Roseanne. I'm just okay. Now everyone has a better reference point. Data collection in accord with code-consistent objectives. Now, if we look at the historical terrain of debates around data collection, not only in Toronto but elsewhere, we know that there have been some very live debates around the uses and abuses of data collection. So, of course, decades ago, in 31 Division, there was a big controversy around data collection as carried out by Julian Fantino. This is before he became chief, in the 31 Division area, where there's some data collected around race and crime, and the data that he presented claimed that there was a disproportionate amount of certain street crimes being committed by members of the black community. And that was data collection done certainly not on the basis of community consultations or on the basis of any sort of code consistent objective. That was data that was largely perceived to be actuated by a desire to demonize the community. So when we talk about data collection in accord with code consistent objectives, we're talking about quite the opposite of what occurred in that particular instance. So the introductory speakers have touched upon some of this. Monitoring and evaluating potential discrimination. Dr. Skelton posed the question, how do we see the transformative shift? How do we gauge the degree to which progress is unfolding? And certainly that is a code-consistent objective. Identifying and removing systemic barriers, that applies with particular force to employment context, but other contexts as well. lessening or preventing disadvantage, and also promoting substantive equality for people identified by code grounds, substantive equality rather than mere formal equality as articulated in this or that document, right? Substantive, real-world equality that leads to meaningful transformations for marginalized communities, including trans communities. Now, when we talk about this slide really intersects with the previous slide to a significant degree. High quality data. What are the uses of good quality data? It helps identify and verify issues, theories, and perceptions. And this is a critical point because what it means to be marginalized and what it means to be oppressed is often, it's often a state in which community members are disbelieved. That didn't happen to you. Are you sure that that wasn't just your perception? That is a view that's commonly propounded by powerful institutions and regrettably sometimes advanced in the police context. So let's go back 10 years to the PACER report, 2012, page 48 of the PACER report. Quote, "The service has acknowledged racially biased policing does exist. Officers believe the service needs to better explain the context of this statement and ensure the public understands the acknowledgement refers to isolated incidents and is not a universal condemnation of all officers." Isolated incidents. Now, the TPS, of course, has moved forward significantly in terms of its recognitions of systemic racism, but it's not ancient history when the issue of racial profiling was being, quite frankly, minimized, even in a document such as the PACER report, which is typically regarded as eminently progressive. But we've seen a shift over the past 10 years to more substantive and robust acknowledgments of systemic racism and a movement away from this idea that it's just, this or that set of isolated incidents. Now, in terms of assisting with measuring a general state of affairs, not limited to specific cases or events, that point intersects with precisely the point that we just raised, right? It's not this incident here, that incident there. It's an agglomeration of patterned incidents directed towards particular communities, including trans communities, that signal a systemic problem. Now, the one part that the PACER report got right is this doesn't necessarily lead to a condemnation of individual officers because that would actually be antithetical to a systemic perspective. And one sort of analytical lens through which we can sort of understand what we mean when we talk about a systemic issue. Think about an intersection, okay? Each year, the insurance industries in this province rank intersections based on the number of accidents that occur. So, for example, Brampton, Steeles and Highway 10 has had a horrible reputation over the years for accidents, okay? What's notable is that when those analyses and the sort of quasi-structural analyses take place, the insurance industry does not come to the conclusion that it's just a matter of a whole bunch of, horrible individual drivers that happen to be congregating at a particular intersection. They take a systemic or almost a structural view and say, what is it about the lanes? What is it about the median? What is it about the lighting that leads to so many accidents taking place at this intersection? And analogously, in policing, and I know we have a commitment here by the TPS, the examination of policies and the examination of procedures and the examination of which practices are incentivized is part and parcel of that view when you're looking at it structurally and saying, why is it that in the year 2022? I'm still in 2021, my apologies. Time lag. In 2022, this is still a live issue. It's because it's systemic, okay? Because every 25 years or so in policing, you have about 100% turnover in terms of the officers who are on the streets. The officers who are on the streets now, most of them wouldn't have been on the streets 25 years ago. But 25 years ago, we could have sat here, and we're sitting here today in the year 2022. That indicates that it's not just a matter of, this or that individual officer who's running afoul of institutional expectations. It's the institution itself which continually produces and reproduces these negative outcomes for members of oppressed communities, including trans communities. And as well, high-quality data enables the development of effective, respectful consultations, and it secures the support of key decision makers and stakeholders. And when the TPS moves forward with the proposed data, that's precisely going to be the bedrock of measuring progress or lack thereof and getting meaningful buy-in from community stakeholders. So that's that's certainly not an exhaustive overview, but that's some of what we're getting at when we talk about the uses of human rights data. Now, to render this more concrete and more specific, we can look at some of the existing data collection regimes that have taken hold in the province. And I want to talk about Ottawa as a fairly good example of how data collection can play itself out in fruitful and transformative and meaningful ways, although the verdict is still out because this stuff is still, in the early stages. And also use of force as at least somewhat problematic in terms of how use of force data is being not so much collected, but how it's being analyzed and how it's being presented. So let's begin with Ottawa. And in Ottawa, there have been, some human rights cases around racial profiling in the context of traffic stops, pedestrian stops as well. But the Ottawa data collection project has involved two studies, one in 2013, the other in 2019. And it's Lauren Foster from York University who's done a lot of this important work. Now, in a nutshell, his studies have shown that over the course of 120,000 traffic stops that have been subject to analysis, there are significant racial disproportionalities in terms of drivers who are Black and of Middle Eastern descent. So Middle Eastern drivers have been stopped 3 times more often than what one would expect based on their representation in the driving population, and Black drivers, there's a 2-fold overrepresentation. And there's all sorts of hair splitting involved in terms of what's an appropriate benchmark, right? We get into all this stuff. Oh, should you do it vis-a-vis the driving population, the general population? How can you drill down to that? We don't have time for that degree of stuff. Dr. Fan might want to weigh in, but I don't have the time for it. So someone else can get into all of that. But the point is, the overarching point, without getting into all of the fine-grained details, is that Lauren Foster and the Ottawa Police, in response to those disproportionalities, Dr. Lauren Foster has stated, we put in place a system where they, meaning the Ottawa Police, have to eliminate by 20% every year those disproportionalities. And that's an important point, because you can have a situation, and you do have situations in the United States, where there's copious, detailed data collection with no movement whatsoever in terms of addressing the injustices. And so, of course, data collection in and of itself is not a panacea, is not a cure-all. It depends on the nature of the institution that's collecting the data and analyzing the data and presenting the data. Okay? Now, based on the work that the TPS has done to date, I think there's reason to be optimistic. But again, it's incumbent upon the community to always remain vigilant. And this sort of leads me to the next point, use of force. Now, police organizations throughout Ontario have been mandated to collect use of force data broken down by race since January 1st of 2020, pursuant to the Anti-Racism Act and a more specific regulation. And there was a lot of sort of promise around the use of data collection in terms of use of force, because we all know that members of certain communities are more likely to be on the receiving end of police use of force than others. And so this is one of the reasons why, when you talk about the rollout of race data in the domain of policing, use of force kind of led the way. I don't need to get into all the details in terms of how much community anxiety and consternation and outrage is stirred up by particular uses of force. on both sides of the border. So when we look, however, at how this data is being presented, and I'm going to use the example of you can use multiple jurisdictions. I pulled some material from the Durham Police Service, okay? Here's a Durham Police Service. In 2020, Durham Regional Police Service tended to roughly 180,000 calls for service that involved prospective police-citizen interactions. DRPS officers attended 259 incidents involving 332 civilians where either one or more levels of force were required to bring the situation to a resolution. Okay, so 180,000 calls for service and 259 incidents. This resulted in 384 completed use of force reports, and the Durham Police went on to note that this represents an extremely low incident rate of less than 0.1% when put in the context of all calls in 2020 involving citizen contact. Furthermore, in 2020, the Office of Professional Responsibility found there to be no public complaints, internal investigations, or chief's complaints where excessive force was substantiated. So 259 incidents, 180,000 calls, okay? So that's 1 out of 697, okay? But that's contingent upon the selection of all citizen contacts of what's known as the denominator, right? So the top number is 259 incidents. The denominator is the 180,000 calls, but you can select a different denominator and have a different presentation of the issue. So it's also the case that in 2020, the Durham Police charged 6,746 individuals, okay? Now think about this. 259 incidents, 180,000 calls for service, 1 out of 697. Or 259 incidents, 6,700 persons charged, 1 out of 26. You go from 1 out of 697 to 1 out of 26, depending on the denominator you select. And that is an issue from a community standpoint insofar as it seems to be it seems to have the effect, I'm not talking about intent, but the effect of minimizing the issue. Because look at the term that's used, an extremely low incident rate. You know? So what you have here is, there's 3 prongs here, okay? You have the assertion of necessity, force was required. You have intentional or unintentional minimization, 1 out of every 697 calls for service. And you also have a claim, okay, of pristine police professionalism. Because in all 259 incidents, there was no excessive force whatsoever. Okay? This is why it needs to be understood by the community, and again, this doesn't address Toronto, this is Durham, but it needs to be understood by the community that data collection can be a double-edged sword. It can either advance the aim of illuminating problems that are regularly articulated by oppressed communities, or it can be used to minimize those problems. And this is why I say, despite the good work that the TPS has done to this point, the community has to remain vigilant. Final slide, and this kind of speaks to the last point that I raised. And so we'll quote a former police superintendent in Edmonton, Christopher Braden, who stated, and I quote, "All organizations live 2 lives. There is the structural life, and then there is the culture. The structure is formal and represents the theory of what is supposed to happen. Culture is informal and represents the reality of what actually does happen. Make no mistake about it. It is the culture that runs things." And so one of the key challenges of this settlement and the work that the TPS is doing is ensuring that there's no gap between what is supposed to happen and what actually does happen. And if there is no gap, then community expectations will have been met and we'll all be in a better situation. And that applies to the members of the trans community specifically and especially. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Chris, very much for that very thoughtful and involved presentation. Appreciate you coming and being a part of this panel discussion for this evening. It's incredibly important information that you shared. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and we're very encouraged by the work that's been done to this point.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. At this time, I'm going to introduce Staff Sergeant Maggie Mastrokostas, who's going to speak about the overview of our policies and procedures, changes that we have made extensively, and the work that has been included with the advisory committee. So I'm going to turn this over to Staff Sergeant for a small presentation. Thank you.
Great. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for your attention. I will be providing an update on the Toronto Police Service procedures, routine orders, and forms that have been changed as a result of this project. I will give you a quick overview in the interest of time, but my understanding is that there is a complete voiceover available on the website. So we'll go through, for the majority, the highlights, and if there are any questions, please feel free to ask. I can hopefully clarify. So the Toronto Police Service, we continue to make progress on several initiatives to ensure that all areas of the organization are updated in terms of with the gender diverse and trans inclusion lens. So as a part of that, we created a new standard of conduct, 1.9.2, titled Respect for Gender Diversity and Trans Inclusive Policing. So I'll read the standard to you. It states that members shall, in the performance of their duty, treat people of all gender identities and gender expression, including trans and gender diverse individuals, with respect, courtesy, and consideration. The standard goes to outline what members shall and shall not do, and that's included both in Module 1 and 2 of the GDTI training. And that was mentioned earlier on in the evening that there are e-learning modules being created so that all members are trained on these changes. Oops, pardon me. So there are stipulations what members shall and shall not do. Members shall comply with standards of conduct 1.9.2 in their interactions, which includes, but it's not limited to, A, respect the rights of all individuals to be addressed by the name, pronoun, and gender that corresponds to their gender identity. B, respect the rights of all individuals to express their self-identified gender, including through access to facilities, clothing, and/or other personal items to support their gender identity and expression. C, respect privacy and confidentiality relating to a person's gender identity and expression. And D, conduct themselves in a manner that is inclusive and respectful of trans and gender diverse individuals and communities. Members shall not knowingly, intentionally, or repeatedly misgender any individual. B, use derogatory, demeaning, discriminatory, abusive, or offensive language relating to gender identity or expression. C, engage in gender-biased policing, which includes stereotyping based on gender identity or expression, or treating an individual's gender identity or expression as a basis for suspicion. D, disclose an individual's trans or gender diverse identity without the individual's consent, except where it's relevant and necessary for the performance of the member's duty, or there's an immediate risk to health and safety. Okay, so some procedures that were amended include the following: search of persons, Appendix C, trans persons, persons in custody, Appendix A, medical advisory notes, Appendix C, designated lockups, 0103, which is transportation and lodging of trans persons, 0505, sexual assault, 0906, property of persons in custody, 1314, human rights, and 1701, news media. So some of the highlights include the chosen name and pronouns. Information about a trans status is now protected. There's a variety of search levels. As well, we've included a portion on gender-affirming items and prosthetic devices. Again, there is a fulsome list of these procedures and all the updates on the website, including some updated definitions. Sure. Yep.
You can do the highlights and then I'll go to the video.
Sure. Okay, so again, some highlights include the duty to accommodate trans and gender diverse people. Chosen names and genders must be consistently used. And the standard for not accommodating is undue hardship. That's been identified. Ideally, people can keep prosthetic and gender-affirming items while they're in custody. And if you're transferring a person to another law enforcement agency, you shall ensure that accommodations are in place for them when they reach that facility. The standard of conduct, the list is included of the different procedures, and I believe that we're going to go through a list of some of the forms that were changed to include the gender portion.
Hello, my name's PC Nigel Thomas from 51 Division. My badge number is 5327. I'm part of the Neighborhood Officer Program, and I'm attached to the Regent Park community. Today we're going to be talking about the booking hall process for an arrested person. Once you're arrested, you'll be brought here into what's called the Sally Port, and then we have a few different steps that we have to take in the process here. So after you're arrested and you're brought in here in the Sally Port, we go through some guidelines before entering the police facility, and then we have these cautions and warnings that are read to the arrested persons. I'm just going to read it verbatim as it is attached to the wall here. It says, "Notice sections of this building, including this area, are videotaped by remote audio-visual recording machines. This equipment is now in operation and you are under observation. There is also a video camera recording the interior of the cell, including the toilet and sink basin assembly. There are privacy covers available for use while using the toilet. If you would like a privacy cover, please make the booking officer or accompanying officer aware." So it's just advising the arrested party that everything that once we enter the door here, it is being recorded out here, but as soon as we get inside the facility, everything is being recorded and monitored by audio and video recording machines, as well as the cells, the interiors of the cells. Those are also recorded. They're not audio, but they're recorded. But then, however, if you would like to have any type of covering, if you need to use the bathroom while you're in the cells, that is offered up to you as well for privacy. The reason why we're explaining this today is that everybody is well aware of the process that they're going to be going through once they're arrested, and that they're aware that once we enter the police facility that everything is being recorded. It's for their safety, number one, and also for officer safety. And we're also explaining the process as we get in there when it comes down to searches and housing where we're putting individuals, and this is for males, females, and trans as well. An example of this is when I have somebody that I've arrested. Prior to getting to this point here, I explain to them what the process, what's going to happen, right? So I allow them to be made aware of their options, what they're going to do, or what's going to happen, and their choices that they're going to be able to make. And I want to do that to show them the respect and also to alleviate any type of anxiety or fears that they might be feeling, which they would normally be feeling once they've been arrested. So presently we're located at 51 Division. 51 Division is a central men's lockup where we typically house just the males. But with that being said, we also have female arrested people that do come into the station, and then once they arrive here, the section that I'm in right now is where we would house females and young offenders, and they'd be positioned in one of these cells here. As well, now with trans individuals could also be housed here as well too, separate from the general population. Well, not really general population, but where all the other males are housed. Once you're coming into the facility, it's up to you. Whatever decision you make, we speak to the officer in charge, and the officer in charge will have various questions for you. One of them would be, where would you like to be housed? And you have that option. You can say you want to be in the main section, or you could be back here in the YO, youth, or trans area. Right? So it's whatever makes you feel comfortable, and it all rests with you. At the same time, the officer in charge will also, prior to you being housed over here, if there's a need for a search, the officer in charge will also ask you your choice in searching and who's searching you, and that could be a various of options. It could be, it's always going to be with two officers, so it's either going to be two male officers or two female officers, or it can also be a combination of one male and one female. And it totally rests with you and whatever you feel comfortable with as well too.
Non-binary people should be housed in a manner that they feel will maximize their safety, which may include an individual cell being held in an interview room, or male or female lockups as per an individual's assessment of what would best meet their needs. And the officer in the video explained the options available, and it's up to the individual to express what they need. Okay, so we've added in the procedure that the first officer, the one that's responsible for the safety and well-being of the victim, the interviewing officer, and the photographer, if there is one, should all be the gender that the victim prefers. Sure. So when a procedure is amended to include current changes, a routine order, what we call a routine order, is released, which explains to members that there is a new procedure, what the changes are, and it directs them to be familiar with what's being released. So The following routine order has been released, service-wide, to notify members of the changes that were made to procedures, policies, and forms. And there were 3. One identified that there was a new standard of conduct. One identified that there was changes made to forms. Okay, and as you mentioned, there's a complete list of the forms that were changed to include changes for the gender fields.
This video hopefully shouldn't be that bad.
CPEU 1, TPS Volunteer Application and Waiver. CPEU 12, Personnel Information Notice, Volunteer Changes. TPS 100, Record of Arrest. TPS 110 Pilot, Shop Theft Report, Ontario Court of Justice. TPS 169, ETF Request for High-Risk Prisoner Escort Witness Protection. TPS 170, Description Sheet. TPS 200, Incident Report. TPS 201, General Occurrence. TPS 202, Missing Person Report. TPS 221, Statement Witness. TPS 227, Person Vehicle for Investigation. TPS 228, Special Address System Report. TPS 232, Missing Person Bulletin. TPS 233, Canvas Interview Form. TPS 250, Immigration Report. TPS 251, Fraudulent Document Report. TPS 252, Homicide and Sudden Death Report. TPS 253, Intelligence Services Case Overlap. TPS 254, Gagnet Toronto Gang Member Report. TPS 270, Source Initial Contact Form. TPS 273, Agent Profile Form. TPS 317, Driver Information Request for Driver's License Review. TPS 326, Traffic Violation Report. TPS 332, Collision Field Notes, Involved Persons. TPS 334, Fail to Remain Report. TPS 471, DNA Adult Offender Blood Sample Checklist. TPS 472, DNA Adult Offender Buccal Sample Checklist. TPS 473, DNA Adult Offender Hair Sample Checklist. TPS 474, DNA Adult Offender Endorsement Checklist, Fingerprints Only. TPS 475, Family Court Order Information. TPS 476, DNA Young Person Endorsement Checklist, Fingerprints Only. TPS 477, DNA Young Person Blood Sample Checklist. TPS 479, DNA Young Person Buccal Sample Checklist. TPS 480, DNA Young Person Hair Sample Checklist. TPS 710, Emotionally Disturbed Person Information Form. TPS 738, Toronto Police Service Youth Referral Form. TPS 813, Personnel Action Notice, Hire, Rehire, Recall 1. TPS 825, Change of Name. TPS 828, Toronto Police Service, Consent to Disclosure of Personal Information. TPS 834, Vessel Collision Report.
I think we're in complaints process.
Yes. Yes. So thank you for that overview. And just so that the audience is aware, all of this information is listed publicly on our website, and you can access. I know that we've been going through quite a bit of content, so just so everybody is aware, this is available on the Toronto Police website. So at your leisure, you can go through all the information that we have shared tonight is made available publicly. So you can access. I know we've gone through quite a bit of information, so it's important that you have time that you can go and look at all the changes that we've made. At this time, I'm going to turn this over to Inspector John Babier from our Toronto Police Professional Standards, who's going to walk you through our complaint process.
And just to say that we've asked for this because the number one concern from community members has been, how do we ensure that people hold to the policies? How do we ensure that people are held accountable for the policy changes in their actions? And that's really what this speaks to.
Thank you. I'm Inspector John Babier. I'm one of 3 supervisors at Professional Standards. Thank you for everybody attending tonight and those joining us online. Professional Standards is responsible for the accountability piece, and all members of Toronto Police Service are required to adhere to the Toronto Police Service core values, the Toronto Police Service governance, as well as provincial and federal legislation. When I say members, I use that term specifically because we often think about uniform members. However, we do have a large contingent of civilian members, as well as district special constables and special constables within our court services. Talking about the provincial legislation, we are governed by the Police Service Act, and right now, that act was written in 1990. It is undergoing I was going to say renovations, but it's revisions. They've got it written, and they are just working on the regulations right now. So we are looking at a new act coming into place very shortly. We are governed by 2 other preeminent oversight mechanisms, being the OIPRD, the Office of the Police Review Directorate, as well as the Special Investigations Unit. The OIPRD manages all of the external complaints. And I'm using 2 terms, external complaints and internal complaints. The external complaints are complaints made by members of the public. Internal complaints are the ones that are designed to ensure the correct discipline of our members, and they are initiated by our supervisors and members of our service. So external complaints will go through the OIPRD. They are an independent agency that was set up to manage the complaints, and the easiest way to file a complaint is actually online at oiprd.com, www. It will walk you through the complaint process. The complaint forms are there, and it will be processed from that point. The other way to make a complaint is to attend any Toronto Police facility. All facilities shall have the complaint forms and booklets at the front desk. And if a person requires assistance, we are obligated to assist and will assist in filing those complaints. Once a complaint is filed, it will be reviewed by the OIPRD. They will review it and ensure that it meets certain criteria, i.e., is the person affected or are they involved in the incident, whether it's service, policy, or conduct. They will then evaluate it. They will assign it to either the service involved, they may assign it to another service, or in fact, they may retain it for investigation themselves. Speaking about the complaints that are referred to professional standards, we have 3 specialized sections at professional standards. We have a criminal investigation section, and I have to say, with a caveat, we are police officers and members of the service 24/7. So our conduct is governed on duty as well as off duty. So we are held to those standards 24/7, 365 days a year. The criminal investigation section will investigate serious allegations of misconduct. And when I use that term, I'd say assaults, domestic assaults, impaired driving, and again, talking about some off-duty conduct as well as on-duty conduct. Our conduct and complaint investigation section, they will often investigate those OIPRD complaints that come in. Our investigative support unit, they are a highly specialized unit that will investigate matters of corruption, as well as we have a special investigation liaison unit that liaises with our SIU counterparts to ensure the transference of information in a seamless manner. We also liaise with the OIPRD for the seamless transition of information for them as required. We are held to high account by them. There are review mechanisms, and in fact, if somebody is not satisfied with the outcome, there is an opportunity for a request for review. That can also be appealed to general division, so there are higher levels of review that can be appealed if the outcome is not what one desired or thought is appropriate. We have about 10 people, 12 people in our criminal investigation section, as well as we have another half dozen people doing the conduct complaints at professional standards. Each section has a supervisor and is led by the respective inspector. Now, walking through the complaint process, we talked about it from the perspective of the complaint being filed with the OIPRD, whether it's assigned to the service. Once it's assigned to our service, we will review it. We will make sure that there's no other criminal allegations or SIU component involved. If so, we will take the appropriate action. If it's one of the more serious allegations or more complex, we will then assign it to the criminal investigation section. It will be investigated, reported upon, and then a copy of the report will go to the complainant. And that's the important thing about complaints made to the OIPRD. The complainants are entitled to a copy of the report, so they will get a copy. As that's different than an internal complaint. We talked about the fact that all complaints can go through a website. They can be done at the station. It's very easy to do it online. And that's the highlights of the complaint system itself. Depending on the severity of the complaint, if it does warrant a suspension, the chief may suspend that member. And again, it's an authority that is conferred upon the chief, officers in charge, all members of professional standards. And the criteria for that really is the seriousness of the misconduct, as well as the impact on the reputation of the service, as well as the public confidence in our service. Now, it also has to consider the impact upon the integrity in the investigation, or it may also have repercussions for workplace harassment. So it may be a matter of suspending that member. Now, the suspension, once it's in fact enacted, it will be reviewed, and it may be continued, or the member may be brought back on administrative duties so that they are not performing frontline duties. And again, there's another set of criteria that's considered. Again, the seriousness of misconduct, the impact on the reputation of the service and the public confidence in the service, the impact on the integrity of the investigation, whether the alleged misconduct occurred in the performance of duty, if there are any imposed bail conditions, the likelihood of the officer reoffending, or any other circumstance that might be deemed appropriate. Now, I did talk about the renovation or the update of the Police Services Act. The one thing that is being contemplated is paid versus unpaid suspensions. Right now, under the current Police Service Act, it is paid suspension. That will change, and there will be circumstances where officers may be put on unpaid suspension. I'll give a caveat. If an officer is sentenced to a term of imprisonment, then it will be unpaid suspension. That's the only piece right now in effect. So that is a very high level overview of the complaint process. I will tell you that we probably have somewhere in the range of about 300 complaints from the public a year that are screened in and investigated by our service. The majority of those are investigated by professional standards, and a small percentage are retained by the OIPRD, or if there's conflict of interest or other issues, they may be referred to other services. And by converse, we do investigate other services at the behest of the OIPRD. So that's a quick overview of the complaint process.
Let's talk about training. And I say that with enthusiasm because I think policy is important, but you have to train to your policy. Training is how we help people understand the concepts, how we ensure people have the knowledge base to put policy into action. So there are 2 training modules. The first training module really focuses on how do we build awareness of issues faced by trans and gender diverse people? How do we build empathy so that anyone who is encountering someone who is trans or gender diverse has an understanding of concerns, has a willingness to be respectful, sees us as fully human, and that fully human piece is really important. We build some common language, we share some terms, we move through a number of community members talking about what they want from police and from policing. We've built tests across the module, so people are moving through sections and taking a test at the end of each section. We've built a branching scenario as well that moves people through what would it look to do things really well, what would it look like to do things acceptably, and what would it look like, and what are the potential consequences both to the trans person in the scenario and to the officer to things being done badly. In the scenarios, we act out the acceptable and the exceptional. We don't act out the negative because we don't want people to have the image of things going wrong. At the end of the module, there's a test. The test is mandatory, and people who are unsuccessful will have to go back and repeat sections of it. So it really is individualized and designed to have people think through and feel through and empathize and understand community members. Module 1 is mandatory for all TPS employees. We've been really clear that the places people might interact with trans and gender diverse members are anywhere the police are interacting with the public. So we don't want to position trans and gender diverse people in criminal roles. We want to acknowledge that there are many different ways trans and gender diverse people interact with police, including potentially being people who are working with TPS. Module 2, and sort of making sure that we're up on the right slide here, Module 2 really looks at the policies and procedures. Module 2 is details around what are the policy changes. We move through the policy changes in detail. We explain the possible implications of them. And then we talk through how do you put these in action. Again, we've made a lot of use of video. It's important that people who are taking the training, so this is all sworn officers, all court officers, and all special constables, understand that this is a requirement of their job. This is something they need to do. It's not an optional piece. It is a requirement of the work. Again, we've built tests throughout the module. We have officers of really quite a range of ranks to say this is everybody's work, from the chief down to a neighborhood officer. Everybody needs to be involved in this work, and everybody needs to take it seriously and responsibly. Thank you. What I would say is, it is really powerful to see a variety of people in a variety of roles speak to these pieces, demonstrate these pieces, model language that will build respect, and really give people a range of tools to get it right. So I'm going to keep my mask off at this point, because we're coming to the question part of things. And ideally, we have questions both from folks in the room and from folks who are participating remotely. And I want to say the question we have on the screen, how do you think TPS should be evaluated to demonstrate that the training provided to its members is effective, is essential that we hear broad answers on. But also, I want to say, I understand if this is not the moment where you have an answer to that question. If you have questions about any of the content that's here this evening, please ask questions about the content. There is a survey on the same poster and on the same link where we're collecting feedback on this question, and that survey will be open for another 3 weeks. So if you need time to think about your answer, if you need time to think about how do you answer it fulsomely, please take that time and ensure that you answer that question.
Did you want to come back for questions?
So to invite people to ask questions, either in the room or, and I think, Rob, you're going to act as our liaison to the internet.
We should have one on the chat.
So we had one question from YouTube. So how do the police balance the rights of someone's sincerely held religious belief versus someone who wants to be called the pronoun of the opposite gender? Do you want me to repeat it, or?
So I'm tempted to paraphrase the question, and I think the question is attempting to say it is a condition of competing rights to have someone who religiously believes that they should not use appropriate pronouns for someone, and someone who wants their appropriate pronouns used for them. And I want to say that this is not actually a situation of competing rights. When we think about competing rights, we think about how central it is to someone's belief, what they're being asked to do, and we think about the impact and harm. And so to say to someone, you need to use the pronouns that someone knows is right for them, does not violate the tenets of a religion and is an aspect of respect. And so there isn't an option where being disrespectful is acceptable on religious grounds.
That's correct, and I'd just like to underscore that the Ontario Human Rights Commission has a policy on competing rights, which speaks to precisely that point, Dr. Skelton, so thank you very much.
Does anybody have anything from the audience? You can just go straight to the mic. Go ahead. Do you want help?
Does it come on?
Actually, I think I'm closer. I'm closer. Yes.
Okay, I would like to ask, does this address, starting at the very, 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 very beginning before anything even happens, and that is, just like racial profiling, we have trans profiling. There used to be a saying in Toronto, oh, I heard you had an interaction with the police last night. What happened? Oh, I got stopped. Why? Oh, because I was walking down the street while being trans. So let's start at, please explain, how does this, at the very beginning, have an effect on that?
Maggie, do you want to talk about the standards? Sure. And requirements around not engaging in gender-biased policing?
Yeah, we have created that standard to address that particular issue. I shall hope that through the training that we are going to be presenting, that there will be more awareness for officers on how to conduct themselves. I should hope that this is not the type of behavior that's happening right now. But yes, you're right. This should be addressed at the very beginning through the training, and the standard does directly address that from the beginning.
And does the evaluation address this?
I'm not quite familiar on how we're going to be evaluating the training. I don't know, Jay, are you able to address the evaluation?
So the evaluating does specifically address this, and it specifically addresses it in a number of points. One, that engaging in gender-biased policing, and I would say the assumption that being trans means you are a criminal, or the other one that we heard a lot in community consultation, the assumption that being trans means you're a sex worker, are both biases, and it is essential that those not be acted out in the course of policing. I'm gonna add that the challenge is, this is widely reported in community, so we heard of this a lot from community. There isn't at this point internal data because we weren't collecting data around trans identities historically in terms of who's being stopped and who's being charged. And the evaluation process will begin to collect data that pays attention to, are people being stopped for being trans? So community is very clear about what's happening, and I will say throughout the training we've also brought in data from community organizations, because often the official data does not show the whole picture. It's also quite clear at the level of strip searching in the training that being trans or having a gender affirming item does not indicate that a strip search is necessary and doesn't elevate the level of a search. So if someone is being searched, there's 3 levels of searches, and it's discovered they have a gender-affirming item, that does not then escalate the search. Because again, that's been a concern that has come up in community.
Mr. Kodak, I'd like to just add a little bit to that as well. And to that answer is that if you look at what Inspector Babiar said in terms of professional standards, that conduct is inappropriate, and these policies and procedures reflect that. And within a very short time, every frontline officer will have a body cam. His interaction, or that interaction, there is a requirement for that interaction to be recorded. And so as part of the complaint process, an individual would be able to initiate a complaint, and the officer of that matter would be investigated, and there should be a body cam recording of that event, so to assist in the investigation and so that corrective action can be taken. So there's a number of things that are in place now that enhance the ability to investigate and to correct that type of behavior.
Okay, thank you.
Just in addition to that too, just add, one of the things separate from this project that goes on an almost daily basis, we have our LGBTQS liaison officer with us tonight. And how many times in a week do you usually go and speak with the college on a course? Once a week, or at least once a week. So almost every week there will be a course at the college, whether it's teaching new recruits who are coming in. Last week I went up and talked a course on intimate partner violence, which had a component to it that speaks to our community. So on a very ongoing basis at the Toronto Police College, there are opportunities for LGBTQ2S liaison officer or myself to be able to speak to some of the things that you're talking about. So they do get addressed right from the moment that recruits walk through the door, but also on an ongoing basis through all of the education that's offered through the college. And I think that's important as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, I would also like to ask, in regard in the interviews, I believe you said 20 or that have been done, how many of those people have actually had an experience with the Toronto Police, or?
So the community interviews, the 20 of them, were with people who had experience with TPS, and it was a pretty wide range from domestic assault to having to call TPS into a workplace because of an incident in the workplace that violated workplace policies, to being detained in transit by transit constables I'm trying to not give identifying information, but also give a sense of the range of
No,
things.
that's fine, as long as you've talked to people that have actually had experience.
That absolutely was the
Yeah,
point
not
of
just
those
theoretical, but have.
Absolutely,
Because I've
that's
got
what those.
tons and tons of people that have written to me.
That absolutely was what that was to do. I will also say I talked to people who'd had interactions with TPS who said, I want to tell you in person, I'm not going to talk to you because my interactions with TPS have left me not wanting to have further engagement.
Mm-hmm.
And that also feels important to document, that there are people who feel so harmed they don't want to participate in research.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's been a long pandemic. I am shy. It's been a long pandemic since I've seen people in person. My name is Susan Gapka. I'm a community member here, a community organizer and political activist, and I have a lot of things going through my mind right now. I'm thinking of that time when I was coming out in Parkdale more than 20 years ago, and I was stopped by a police car, and I was doing the coming out thing, going to Church Street, had the fur coat on and the high heels, and apparently I was suspected of doing a burglary in the neighborhood with high heels and a wig and a fur coat on. And so I'd like to think, and it's happened a few other times since then, so I'd like to think that we're making a big amount of change. I just want to say, go on the record, and thank you all, the panel, Dr. Jay Wallace, Lisa Crocker, Police Chief, Professional Standards, my friend from the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and I am I don't know your name, but, and all the work, Maggie and Rosemary, but as much as just the amount of resources, the journey that people like Boyd and myself and others in our community have taken to get to this point, it's been a difficult journey. As you said in the first panel, Jay, Dr. Jay, this is some of the hardest work we do. But to see the amount of resources, the people here tonight on the panel, gives me a good feeling of hope. A feeling that if we keep pushing and holding the police accountable, and we will, and there's people not in this room tonight who you can count on holding this accountable, and with correct correct is the wrong word in this context, with good, effective evaluation of the training and procedures and room for marked improvement, I feel good about the direction we're in after that night. I faced those two police officers, and they took off when I started to take their license plate number down. But that was a terrible experience for me. And I want to hope that people, trans and gender diverse people in our neighborhoods, in our communities, that when we have an interaction with Toronto Police Services, that it doesn't set us back so far in trauma and in despair and repeat the mistakes of the past. And that whatever that interaction is, hopefully it's more positive. You find missing persons. We come into the justice system, that we don't leave that system more wounded than when we entered it. And so I want to thank you for being here tonight, and I just hope that we keep moving this forward and we have more of these community conversations. I do want to ask, can I ask a question about data? That was a bit of my rant, but see, I said I was shy. But my question is on the data. It's about who collects the data, how the data is. In my view, I'll tell another story. When I first did a flu shot about 20 years ago, and they asked me if I was male or female, and I said, you're asking the wrong questions. Because if I say one and it's incorrect, either one I answer, it's going to be incorrect because I'm a woman, but like, how you're measuring it. So a bit of question on the data collection and how we can move from sex and gender, sex data collection to using more gender terms and like man, woman, and non-binary. And the whole question of how non-binary people fit into this new improved model. And hopefully we hear from some of those people as we move on the process. Thanks. That was a long one. There was nobody else in line.
Susan, can I ask you to really clearly state the question again? Because I want to make sure we get it right.
Thank you. So historically, we've collected data, and the officer in the video talked about male and females sections. So I'm wondering how that data is collected, how sex is transferred to gender, its gender identity, and how we move from a system of sex characteristics data collection to a gender characteristics data collection. And I know it's hard to change things that have been historically entrenched, and for sexual orientation and gender identity criminalized and incorrectly collected and used often in negative ways. Was that helpful?
So I think what you're asking is,
thank you.
The language has often been sex terms, male and female. And what makes sense in terms of people's lived experience is gender terms. So man, woman, non-binary, two-spirit, other terms that may feel appropriate to someone. So a lot of those forms, there was an open field where people could write in the words that were right for them. There also are TPS forms that have unknown on them. And to be clear, that unknown is a temporary step for the person will not disclose, and I am not making an assumption. It is not in any way intended to be, I looked at that person and I can't figure them out. And so there's also very clear training around how that unknown category is to be used, because we want to break the pattern of looking at someone and making an assumption and saying we know who they are. There are TPS forms that still say male and female, and you're right, man and woman is more appropriate language. And they continue to say male and female because they're not forms that are owned by TPS. They're forms that connect to provincial and to national data collection systems where that language is used. And I think you overheard me saying earlier that I think the minutes of settlement have a lot of really smart pieces in them, including that it obligates TPS to advocate on behalf of trans and gender diverse people to other policing bodies. So I've had conversations with other people at this table around what does that mean to challenge national data collection, to challenge provincial data collection, to make those more representative and more appropriate for trans and gender diverse people's lives. And I want to say this work isn't done, and I'm sort of looking at Lisa, because Lisa, you've been part of these conversations, and I think you can probably speak to where that work is.
Yes, so just to add, Susan, thank you. So one of the things that we have started the conversation is with the RCMP and the CPIC, which we do not have control over, but when looking at our prisoner management system and looking at our master index with the names, we have brought this to outside agencies to start those conversations, to make those changes in line with the changes we have made at Toronto Police, to be advocates for that change and to bring it to higher levels of government and to other agencies' awareness. So those are ongoing conversations that we're having to address the very things that you just brought forward tonight. So thank you for that.
And I'm going to say I think this is a place where community can continue to hold TPS accountable and continue to say, has there been change? What's the change? Where's it coming from? What's needed to make that happen?
Yes, that's what I was trying to say, Dr. G.
We didn't have any more questions online. And if there are no other questions from the audience, I don't know if Laura and Mai wanted to say anything. It was really from equity, inclusion, and human rights.
Thank you very much. I found this whole session very insightful, and thank you, Susan, for your question. I learned a lot from just listening to you and your experiences, and I also, the whole experience has left me feeling hopeful, but also to think more critically about our data, and also the question of intersectionality as well. Hearing Dr. Williams speak about, racial profiling and data systems and how we analyze our data to understand ourselves, and also understand our impacts and experiences of communities with policing is very important. And that includes the intersectionality between gender and race and sexual orientation. And so how can we improve in how we do things to support the dignity of people in our communities, support our officers to be better and to do better, and hold ourselves accountable and be transparent. So all of that is, very inspiring conversation, and the changes that have been made to our forms gives me a lot of hope that we're moving in the right direction. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone at the panel.
Okay, since there's no more questions, I want to just take this opportunity to thank everyone who's here today, and for those that have joined us online. I really want to acknowledge the work, the members of the organization here that are involved, Lisa and company, and everybody. They've done some terrific work here and have, thank you, Susan and Mr. Kodak, a genuine and sincere commitment to making things right. And I really too want to acknowledge on the panel here, first of all, Christopher Williams with the Ontario Human Rights, providing a lot of guidance, holding us accountable, but doing it in a very collaborative way that has been very, very helpful to helping us as an organization to move forward. And I have to tell you that Dr. J here, what a success that was in that selection to engage him, to engage Dr. J to be involved with us. Just done tremendous work that's really helping this organization move forward. And I really see an opportunity to change both the processes, as you've seen identified here today, but also the culture of the organization. And so I just want to reiterate what I said in my introduction. Please be patient. We are moving forward. You're going to see some changes, I think, in the next 6 months with everybody being changed, everybody being trained, that we'll see some good outcomes. And we're committed to seeing those good outcomes happen. So thank you very much.